We're making progress on features or feature sets. Even a year ago, I thought would take a year to make meaningful improvements on Git and capacity and discovery timelines and all of the things that slow products down. We're making progress on them in 2-week sprints and finding where the other bottlenecks are in the process to get us to production.
Welcome to LaunchPod, the show from LogRocket where we sit down with top product and digital leaders. We've all been witness to how AI collapses the org chart. Leaders are back doing IC work, ICs are shedding the busy work, and teams are shipping features in 2-week sprints that used to take a year. Our guest today is Eric Anderson, SVP of Product at Datasite, the virtual data room platform where billion-dollar M&A deals get done. He walks us through how a real-life AI-first team made progress in adoption and the difficulties along the way. In this episode, Eric shares how the contract has changed as the PM role has evolved. It's not a layoff story, but product has collapsed back to subject matter expertise, judgment, and taste. Inside their iteration zero process, where PRDs are written live in the meeting, prototypes are wired to real data, and what the new bottleneck is now that building is fast. Plus, how you build trust in your AI product. When $1 billion on the line, you need citations for everything, correlation, not imperative statements, and why nobody lets the computer decide. So here's our episode with Eric Anderson. All right, Eric, welcome to the show, man. Good to see you again. How you doing?
Great, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm excited for this one because I think it's been interesting where we've seen this major change of as AI has kind of changed how we worked, like more and more people getting back to practitioner level and some of that changing. And you have kind of great insights around this, and I think I've experienced as much as anyone, but a great story to tell around it. So I want to dive into that. But I think before we do that, just to set context and introduce you real quick, what's the TLDR? How'd you get from, starting in tech up to SVP of Product over at Datasite?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting how everything old becomes new again in terms of being a leader and being an IC and how that all flows around. But to answer your question, how did I get here? I think like so many people, my path into product was serendipitous. I really never had any aspirations to get into product until I learned about what it was. It's not like I woke up one morning and said, someday I'm going to become a product manager. I happened to be in an account management job, basically the other side of the sales coin, and had a client in town here in Denver, and was in their building every other week doing demos. And at one point, their SVP of product, again, everything comes full circle, asked me if he could take me out to lunch. And I assumed he was going to want to renegotiate our hourly rate. But instead, he explained his business model for this product that we've been working on. So it's fairly familiar. And he said, I really need a leader to take over a senior product manager role for this product. And I think you'd be really good at it. And I told him I was honored and I didn't really know what that meant, but I'd like to learn more. And the universe just delivered it. And I've worked in product ever since.
It's always so funny to see that because I feel like everyone I talk to says like, oh, I have a non-traditional path into product. But I think in all honesty, the person who I meet one day who said like, oh, from the beginning, 25 years, I've been a product manager, that would be the non-traditional path into product. Is everyone has kind of fell into it. Because when we both started, there wasn't really a product role. It didn't exist back then, or if it did, it was a shell of what it is now. But I do think that said, of all the stories I've now heard, going from sales into product, it probably is one of the more unique ones. So I'll give you that.
Yeah, that might be true. It's interesting though. The team that I was so thrilled to take over in that job, to your point, nobody came from product because it wasn't a thing. They may have been in sort of embedded analysts. That was probably the closest thing to a product manager. But most folks came from customer service or design.
I digress, but on to, you started out in sales, you moved up and got this kind of serendipitous move into product and continued through education and, multiple different industries until you find yourself now at Datasite, which is, for people who don't know, basically virtual data rooms, right? So very high privacy, very high trust. But the interesting thing is you can go from that industry to e-commerce and almost anything in between. And I think this experience of how AI is changing how we work is true. So maybe we just dive into that. Let's talk a little bit about what you guys have experienced. Because I think this view of it used to be, you come in, you're strategic and you have a bunch of people doing work, and that has changed. Like, how have you guys experienced it over there? What's that look like at Datasite right now?
Yeah, it's been as transformative and disruptive as it probably has for everybody else. We talked previously, and I talk all the time when I'm interviewing folks or coaching folks about climbing up and down the ladder. And I don't mean the corporate ladder in terms of role. I sort of mean you could think of it as the very bottom of the tech stack up to where the customer meets your product. You could talk about it in any sort of technical architecture sense. You could talk about it more pragmatically from going from customer service to sales to design. But as a product person, you're moving around the org all the time. I often say, I go from rolling up my sleeves and getting my hands dirty with whiteboard ink all the way to like, oh, I need to go wash my hands and throw my sport coat on because I'm going to present to the board. And that's just a very common sort of whiplashy type of day in product. And that remains true. But what's changed over the last, we'll say, year or so, and especially the last 6 months, is climbing up and down the ladder, as we said, is more like riding a high-speed elevator. And it's really collapsed the org chart. I'm sure your listeners and viewers know this, but there's a lot of LinkedIn and news article activity and literature right now about the flattening organization and how the flattening organization is better suited for what's happening with AI. And I'm finding that to be true. And it doesn't necessarily mean job loss or minimizing people's role. I think it's quite the contrary. It means that everybody increasingly, if they were a leader who did no IC work, is going to have to do a lot of IC work to be successful and to navigate this. And similarly, if you were an IC and you felt like you were doing a lot of busy work, the expectation now is, well, the busy work gets done for you if you've got the right ideas. And so there's a real leveling of that playing field and a real leveling of the expectation of how you spend your precious time every day.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember, many years ago now when I had kind of my first big company director job, and there was one or two of us who were kind of new to big team leadership, and we all would get together, and I know a lot is getting done, and I know I help the team move and tackle the most important things, but I'm not doing the work. I just spend my day talking about work. And it's interesting because I always kind of chafed under that and pushed where I was getting involved in something and always had like spikes I was going to work in and tell the team, it's not you, it's I want to stay close to, I can't possibly be my best if I'm not close to something here to keep understanding, keep sharp. But I definitely saw some people, peers move the other direction where they embraced, oh, I don't do it, I just plan it. And I see those people, when I keep in touch with them, struggling a lot more because, I think, like you said, you've always kind of gone up and down. If you didn't do that, though, you might find yourself in a rough spot right now. The peer talkers, I don't know.
You're right. No, you're absolutely right. I think that'll play out across different functions. But if you think about your general archetype of a designer or an engineer, they have that job because they like to do stuff. But people in product, you could sort of pick that path. I think you're exactly right. When I flash back to that job that I got, 9 years later, when I decided to leave, my wife and I were talking about it. And I said, I don't get to build stuff and deliver stuff anymore. I'm in a sport coat. I'm on an airplane. I sort of stand up and I do a quarterly big dog and pony show. And it's really important. I don't need to minimize what I was doing. It really helped connect the work to the business and the planning and the investor market. But I am somebody who likes to get my hands dirty. And so when I first, as an example, started paying for my own Claude over a year ago, I immediately started thinking about small businesses I might create, not to really operationalize them, just to see if I could come up with something using these tools. And it really re-inspired me. It's really fun. We tell people, if nothing else, just dive in. Just start using these tools. We've got tremendous access and materials to self-train. And by the way, if you ask Claude or OpenAI to train you on using them, they will. So, it's just been an incredibly inspiring time as somebody who likes to make stuff, to just dig in and throw your title aside, just start to build stuff.
You're diving in, you're doing more within Datasite. I guess, what is this kind of like change of how people operate? What does that look like across the product team and across how they work with you? And how has that kind of changed, how do people do stuff? And have you found those gains of, harder, better, faster, stronger with AI yet? Or is the team kind of getting there still?
Yeah, we have found gains, and something we'll come back to in a moment is we've also figured out where the next set of, fail points or pressure points are, which I think is natural. But what I like to do to start the framing of this when we're talking with teams, we're doing a lot of piloting of new ways of working, but also new feature builds and new imaginations of feature functionality, not yet in production, right? So almost like a full stack experiment as a pilot. And so then as we broaden out and we talk to other teams, okay, here's what we're learning. one of the things that we've really come to almost, it's become kind of the calling card or the headline of everything is the contract has changed. And what's so cool is that didn't come from leadership. That came from one of my senior principal PMs. We were just a couple of weeks into a pilot and he said those words, Eric, the contract has changed. And I said, man, that's like, tell me more. What do you mean? And what we're finding to be true is rather than things being process and training driven, and here's how we do things around here, it's almost like the product person's dream where the catalytic moment is from the idea, whether the idea is around a problem that we've had trouble solving in the past or a solution that somebody's been dreaming of building but can't. And that becomes sort of the icebreaker, the thing that goes first. And then the ways of working just fall into line around that center of gravity. And I think if you ask people like us who got into product for a reason, how we'd like to work, that would be it. Like no entrepreneur in the fabled garage, when they come up with their idea says, man, I can't wait to come up with a cool process to deliver this thing. They're passionate about delivering the thing.
I can't wait to sit in an awesome quarterly planning meeting and really get into the meat of what we're going to build our KPIs around and OKRs for the next 4 quarters. Yeah, exactly.
Right. I can't wait to wrangle my PRD into this new PowerPoint template and 8-point font. Right. But what we get excited about is I think I've got this idea, and the ability to move from idea to building a foundation to execution in minutes or hours is almost exactly why we liked this job at some point so much in the first place. So to answer your question directly, what has changed is the PRD now, as an example, we formulate in the first meeting, call it an iteration 0 meeting, perhaps. And the product person or the designer says, okay, here's what we're thinking. We want to solve problem X, or we've got this idea that we've been batting around that we think would be really cool. Let's call it solution A. And in that moment, if you're using perhaps Whisper or even Claude's audio or OpenAI's audio feature on desktop or mobile, we've now got it where it authors your PRD on the fly while it's listening to you. The lines between engineering, UX, products, and other folks that might be involved get increasingly blurred. And everyone just kind of jams on an idea and decides what they want to do coming out of that. And the process just increasingly falls in line. Now, that's not to say it's perfect, and it's not to say that we've got it exactly right yet, but we're almost to the point where you can come out of that iteration 0 type meeting and you've got your PRD, you've got the elements for engineers to come back and ask the harder questions, for them to set up an environment and to start to do everything that takes the prototype directly into code. And even if necessary, pulls from real live data so that we're not mocking things up and building vaporware. And if I think back to when I started working in product, I mean, that would have been the dream. But instead, we built a prototype and hooked it up to dummy data, and then perhaps linked it into a PowerPoint.
Like if you were lucky, you built a prototype, right?
Right.
It's funny to go through like where people are and just see. And I started listening back to old episodes because we haven't been doing this that long, right? Like we started this podcast, I think I'm gonna guess and say late 24. I might be slightly off there, but AI has been a theme throughout the entire thing, and it's been interesting to kind of go back and listen to a couple old ones and just every couple quarters pick one, because what was revolutionary 12 months ago is now blasé. You're like, oh, I mean, we would have used to like to make just a prototype, but now we're doing this thing. But it wasn't even 12 months ago where people were mostly ecstatic to be able to even build a real prototype and just get out of flat files in Figma. And that's how the contract had changed. I think it is one of the undersells of the century. It's really accurate, but it's also, it's very easy to take something that pithy and concise and miss the magnitude of what has changed.
Yes, absolutely.
And I got to ask, because this is always one of my favorite topics. If you look at, LinkedIn or any of maybe those channels where you get all the influencers and stuff like that, I am assuming you have not replaced your entire team of 40 product managers with an AI agent. What is the difference actually for these people that are on the team day to day?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think especially given the audience of your podcasts, this is critical. It's, again, if we move away from LinkedIn or, people always talk about Instagram as where people live their fake lives, right?
The
LinkedIn,
theater of AI.
The theater, right. And LinkedIn is too. So let's call it what it is. People are afraid for their job security and their relevance, whether that means something as drastic as a layoff, or does it mean that I sort of become a BA for an agent or something, right? Like any number of those fears are there. What we're seeing is, especially for folks who are willing to just dive into the pool and take that chance and get out of their comfort zone, is, that climbing up and down the ladder we talked about, the removal of the scaffolding that we talked about is really empowering. People get to do the thing that makes them like their job and why they got hired, which is to be a subject matter expert that knows how to build and utilize relationships internally, that has good judgment, and that has good taste. It's tremendous. It levels the playing field in that way. And so that's what we're seeing. We're making progress on features or feature sets that even a year ago, I thought would take a year to make meaningful improvements on, given capacity and discovery timelines and all of the things that slow products down. We're making progress on them in 2-week sprints and finding where the other bottlenecks are in the process to get us to production. And that's the problem you want to have. I oftentimes think about product very much in terms of like both classic design thinking, but also like manufacturing metaphors or analogies. Like I think about a manufacturing floor and something, raw materials moving through the process to become a constructed thing. And as far back as the Industrial Revolution, you look at those types of processes to find the blockages, the slowdowns, the fail points. And a lot of what we're seeing is that with more people getting to use their great human judgment, their subject matter expertise to put forward great ideas, we're just finding where the other slowdown points are, which also makes our delivery all that better. But gone are the days when the slowdown point is we have a great idea on June 11th, and we can't even get a look at it until July 11th. And it's certainly not going to go live until August 11th.
Right. Maybe we'll talk about it for the next quarterly, epic, where it could make into a sprint halfway through, 2 quarters out kind of thing. I do love this kind of renaissance of people talking about it like a factory again, because for the longest time, feature factory was a pejorative. Right. It was one of the worst things you could say about a company. But now people talk about it in driving this kind of software factory or solution factory. But I think it was always important to keep in mind, Ferraris are made in a factory too. But I think the metaphor holds a bit where you look at the difference was you were creating, maybe I won't name big industrial factories where you owned maybe one widget being installed 18,000 times. And now it's but the Ferrari factory has a very few people working on a car throughout the whole thing or a lot further through. And there's a lot more crossover, a lot more expertise. And that's a beautiful work of art produced, in a highly skilled way. It's still a factory. And that seems to be more the model of what this is moving to, where you're seeing these kind of ideas of people expanding. And the idea, this guy, Ajia Desway, who speaks with us a lot as we travel and kind of do these dinners, this concept of the hyper creator, where, maybe product folks are picking up development skills and design skills, or designers are able to go further forward, or engineers are going further back, but a more diverse, complete skill set. And in the end, that's probably going to be what's going to, persist, is going to be being able to do more and do it better and bring that taste and execution. But that's far more interesting in my mind than just owning, I drill this widget in and I'm the best widget driller in the world.
I totally agree. 2 fun thoughts on this, just top of my head. One is, as the lines between the roles blur and people are hyper creators, which I love that term. I see an empowerment of that group of people where they're all really focused on their outcome or the problem that they want to solve.
Yeah.
And if the product person decides at 11 p.m. that they get a wild hair and they want to create the next version of the app overnight so that the engineering team can see it in the morning, there's already, just in the last few months, there's less of the engineering vibe going like, well, why did you do that? That's mine. And similarly, if an engineer goes, I was talking to sales guys at this conference and they thought we should tackle it more this way, everybody just jumps in and collaborates immediately. Yeah. And that's been really empowering. The other thing that you made me think of with the factory conversation is, I'm sure we've all either done or at least had ideas of a net new product, perhaps a consumer product or a physical product. And if you do that, one of the things that you do is you basically interview factories to make sure that you trust that they're going to deliver something of quality on time and on budget for you. And I think if we talk again in 6 months on the podcast, we might be in a position where we're saying we are seeing product people, creators, hyper creators with a little more power in the job market as well, because they're able to go to a company and say, I know how to work optimally now. I want to make sure I work at a place whose operations are set up so that we can really work like this. And I think that's a really powerful thing for product people to think about too. It can feel a little disempowering and a little scary right now. The LinkedIn headlines can be scary, but I think there's a real empowerment for product and creative people coming with knowing what good looks like in terms of how the delivery and the factory actually work.
It seems like the fastest things is kind of sped up. One is code is far faster to produce now. And we can make the argument that review processes and some of these are not, quite sped up as much, but it's definitely faster produced code than ever before, and good code, especially as every model progresses. The thing is, most of us sell to people still at some level, and they're not going to be able to intake faster because a lot of this, like as a consumer, I'm still only going to need the features I need, or I'm only going to be able to process, whatever 3 features that my brain can process from X vendor every month or every week. When Anthropic went through that miracle spring they had, where it's like 78 features in 60 days or something, I think I used 3 of them. So what it comes down to is you're either going to burn your audience out, or you can work on a lot of things, but you have to find a way to quality gate them and figure out which ones do your entire audience need to see, or do your entire customer base need to see? What's going to be the most valuable? And in the end, that's still going to come back to how do you have taste about what they need? How do you solve problems well? And how do you kind of figure that process out? And like you said, I think the people who are going to be able to do that are going to be increasingly valuable. We might see a blip right now where people are figuring it out, but I don't know. The companies growing the most are not shedding people. They can't hire fast enough. And if I look at that as a model, I generally think like anyone in any other case is probably like, all right, you're catching up or you're figuring stuff out, which is fine.
I think you're right. Yeah, there's it's almost a trope now, but countless people will say, myself included, the more I use these tools and the more I use them with real confidence and with intention, not just experimenting, but knowing where I want to get from using the tool, the more work stacks up for me.
Yeah. I'm busier than I've ever been.
That's right. I mean, it's careful what you wish for. Even since we talked last time, I have created 2 massive strategy documents. I don't mean massive in page number, but huge volumes of work. Try to keep them at 10 or 12 pages with a solid 1-pager as the intro. That's my rule for myself. But you can pack a lot of content into 10 or 12 pages.
Yeah.
And I do them exclusively on Friday afternoons and on Sundays. And these things each would have probably taken me 6 months, not all that long.
Right. Well, it's, we had Laura Burkhauser on recently. She's the CEO over at Descript. Incredibly fascinating human. But she talked about one of the things that I think is one of my favorite. I love a good 4-box. I don't know, maybe it's because I went to the business school in me, but I love a good 4-box. It's one of my favorite diagrams you can make. And she brought forth one of the best ones I've ever heard to apply to right now, which is basically categorize the stuff you love and don't love, and can AI really help it or not? And basically the idea was we're not looking to have people just be, sitting there and just prompting and be basically the human harness for AI. We're not looking to shed good people either, because AI can amplify greatness. It can also, the other way, it can also amplify people who are less effective, let's say, can be less effective at a lot more things. But this concept of like, look at and understand where you can take the things that would be great to do with AI and you don't love doing, and just that's the stuff that you can really remove from a lot of what you're doing on the day-to-day, and they get done still. And then look at the stuff that you love doing and needs a human to do, and that's the special stuff. And I think that's the areas we're spending more time in right now, because all this other work that we're doing faster enables that. At least that's what I've seen on my end. Is I'm busier than ever, but I love it. It's really interesting work that I get to do. But if we select right, if you don't select right, you can just, what I'm not doing is writing 75,000 tweets a day that are just brainless rejiggerings of stuff on the internet. So
yeah, I think that's true. There's that great book, Deep Work, by an author. His first name is Cal. I forget his last name, but if done right, a lot of this allows us to focus on the deep work. Exactly what you said. Also tethers very much to the Datasite flavor of all of this. You think about the vast majority of our users, a lot of their work is incredibly high stakes. It is high pressure. serious business. I had actually lived through it. I was on a divestiture team for 6 months, and every single day had moments that felt like make or break, really stressful. Everything's due at 11:59 p.m. and you always feel like you could be the fail point. It may not be true, but it really does feel like that. But what's weird is the tasks are simple and mundane and repetitive. And these are precisely what you're talking about. I think of those as first mile tasks. It's a great analog to why legal tech was one of the first to really hit their stride in this AI revolution. A lot of the work is time consuming, repetitive, and especially as your mind fatigues, it's where you can make mistakes, but it's not rocket science. But the attorney, their magic is their subject matter expertise, their deep training. And so to get that first mile of work done for an attorney or a junior banker on an M&A deal in a way where it might save you 6 or 8 hours a day, it doesn't mean that then you go play golf. It means that you use your human brain while it's sharp and not fatigued to do the really hard decision-making, the judgment calls, and to make sure that the internal nuances of your organization or of that deal team are taken care of. And oftentimes, in my experience, that deep work happened late at night and I was really tired. Right.
Yeah, it's funny you brought this up because when you and I first met and you were telling me about Datasite, and I remember thinking just how possibly are you fitting? Is the same? It seems very similar to me as like medical and things like that, where people are gonna be really worried about all the very sensitive data that's in there for a lot of these companies. But I remember 2 things. One, I went to business school, and so I had a lot of friends that went into kind of junior banking roles where they were doing the scut work on paper processing and all that kind of stuff to clear those deals. And the same thing with like deal rooms. I actually sold a small business at one point, and that was the hardest part, was just documenting everything and going through it and just the nuance. And you're going to get a better outcome if you have this data better set together, and you can parse it better and you can present it better and you know it really well. You are going to have a better position of power for the most part in getting a good outcome for yourself. And I always thought that was strange. And talk about what Datasite did here. I thought that was just, it seems tight, but it's incredibly powerful and useful for what AI has been already.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's one of the most perfect use cases for how the AI revolution has played out, because the way we think of ourselves is the VDR, the virtual data room. And just for listeners, if in 10 seconds, if they're interested.
Yeah, maybe you can explain real quick.
Well, so not too long ago, a data room was actually a room. So if 2 companies were engaged in a merger or an acquisition, they would oftentimes use a conference room in one of their offices or even rent a room at a hotel. So it would be sort of a neutral site, like a conference room. And they would fill the room with bankers' boxes full of actual documents. And they would allow people in and out. There would be security. You'd have to leave your cell phone, your laptop in a locker and go in, and attorneys and accountants and deal teams would go in and actually review documents for days at a time. And so the reason they call it a virtual deal room is because in that world, people understood, oh, this is a virtual version, finally, of this physical room. And so you can imagine a human mind or half a dozen human minds having to process 15,000 documents, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. It's mostly theater. Nobody's processing all of that, right? You're mostly scanning and looking for red flags and just doing your best with, you guessed it, judgment to make sure that things seem like they're checking out. But these processes take multiple months and they're high stakes and they can be risky. So that's sort of the nature of the virtual data room. That's why Datasite exists, is to, automate that. But then the next step, where the things we're talking about come together, well, the tasks that people have to do as part of a deal team are, like we said, repetitive. They're not super highly skilled, but they require a lot of training and good judgment. But they just take a really long time. And so, exactly to your point on the legal side, if we can massively expedite the understanding and synthesis of lots of information so that the subject matter experts can make their decisions and use their judgment and speed up that process, all the better. But you're not removing the human as the source of judgment. Nobody with their finger on the trigger of $1 billion deal is going to say, I don't know, let the computer decide.
Claude told me it was good, so we're just going to YOLO it and go for it, right?
That's right. That's right. And then, one of the things we talked about previously, and I'm sure listeners and so forth think about, is, well, where's the line? If you're using these tools to understand all this stuff, and just like with legal tech and medical tech, that's where permissioning comes into play. That's where the idea that if I'm the administrator on the deal room and I'm deciding which groups can see which content, perhaps in what format or for how long, if I can redact certain things before anybody sees it, and I get to control the flow of permissions, I can use all of that powerful AI technology for purposes that it's very well suited in a way that does not inject risk to me as the one who needs to make sure that this information and the data is sacred. And so this sort of governance architecture that AI allows us through permissioning in and out of data rooms and permissioning of particular content becomes this real sweet spot where you don't disintermediate people and their expertise and their judgment, but you drastically accelerate the kind of menial work that it takes to get the room ready.
I guess from a product standpoint, and I realize this is kind of an active product development thing, so maybe there's only so deep you can go, but how do you determine, there are some things that it just needs to be dictionary truth. It needs to be accurate, and probably the answer ends up being, for the most part, a human really just needs to read something and see it or have heavy citation and know where to look. But there's this other general piece of this, which is understanding a huge amount of content and just kind of generally understanding, like, is there something of risk here? Do I need to dive deeper? How do you actually break those two down where, at some point, is it actually product experience differences or people told, like you kind of talk about permissions being different and stuff, but what does that look like to the user and how are you ensuring, like, I as a seller am not getting in trouble because I'm like, oh, let's use this and you provide this. And then all of a sudden it's like the tool you chose gave me bad insights kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that's changing and evolving all the time.
Yeah.
But you already nailed it. A lot of it is the kind of disclaimer language that we all see, and especially in the chat bots when we use these tools all the time. So you see two big paradigms. One is citation. So when you're really deeply interrogating content and perhaps you're comparing what's called change of control clauses within an M&A deal, or you're looking at the entire footprint of a company's leases, perhaps they have physical locations all around the globe. And so your leases internationally become a really complicated fabric, right? And you are just doing some compare and contrast between, say, 2 or 200 documents. In that kind of a workflow, citations are everything because you're not going out to the public internet. The tool isn't going and saying, I don't really understand. Let me add semantically some additional context.
See what Google thinks.
Yeah, right. You're very much in a walled garden. But what it's doing is saying, well, we found that the leases in Portugal, cited here, tend to have this, common thread that you don't see in Spain. Looks like something you should probably check out. And even the choice of language there is important. Rather than saying you should check this out, oftentimes what we seek to do is say deals that successfully close tend to remedy differences like these.
Yeah. Correlation, not imperative.
That's right. It's not the tool told me to. It's saying we've got a vast amount of data from 10 plus years of running a business like this that tells us that people that have kind of conflicting information in their leases, they do better if they remedy that before they share it out with potential buyers. And then secondly, in a chat, when you're involved in more of a natural language chat that's more free flowing, but you're still within the walled garden of the data room, just like all of us experience every day now, you say, there's always the disclaimer where it says something like, this was generated by an AI tool. It can make mistakes, check your work.
A paradigm that seems to be really kind of replicating itself because we had a guy on the show called Robert Hankhouse. He works at a company called Inveris, and they do basically, literally, if you watch the show Landman, he grew up in that. It's a company that helps big oil companies kind of parse data around where they should drill, and they're giving insights for, multi-million, if not, $100 million investments. And the key there is you have to cite, citing everything, showing truth and building trust that these insights are worth it. But on our end at LogRocket, it's, it is likely a slightly less risky thing. I don't think anyone's, wagering $100 million on a single website experience, but to go in and, it watches experiences for you and tells you where in your digital experience people are running the problem or where the friction is. It's been interesting showing this around and getting feedback from, kind of product folks and engineering and everything, that one of the biggest things is it doesn't just tell you something broadly or give you some blanket insight. It cites, here are the sessions to watch if you want backup of this to really see it in proof. here's the correlational data, here's how to reproduce it. And it's all the context and understanding and like that kind of, the same way that we've seen a lot of deals like this not go well because of this. And you should, ones that remedy this do better. It's this vast amount of proprietary data you've built before that you're able to form opinions off of later that is driving a lot of what is really the valuable insights and not just kind of the AI slop that we see in too many places.
Exactly right. I mean, one of the natural questions for a customer, I always try to use these storytelling devices. Like, imagine you're talking about your job with a neighbor who's a really smart person, but your neighbor's a dentist or somebody who doesn't think about software and AI all day like we do. And they might say, yeah, but I mean, couldn't you just go do that on ChatGPT? And exactly what you're talking about becomes kind of the interesting conversation with them is like, yeah, you absolutely could. But what we're querying against is a vast pool of knowledge based on historical trends. We never reveal names or deal names or anything specific, no PI, anything like that. But we've got context that the public internet just simply wouldn't, or at least that the general user wouldn't be able to sort of ascertain through prompting and skills on the public internet. And it becomes a very powerful story in that way.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how this evolves where, it does seem to be accumulated information. Taste has become a bigger and bigger thing, and just marrying the ability and expertise developed over years, or just not naturally inherent in someone, against what AI can do is kind of giving these huge gains. So it's interesting to see how the world has developed. I'll be honest, I love stories, and AI, like you said, not everyone's like this where they think about it all the time, but it is something that crosses my mind quite a bit. I could go on, and I think my team would tell you that's true. You have some pretty innovative stuff over at Datasite that probably needs to keep going. On my end, I'm getting looks already that it's time to wrap this up. And it's been a blast. Time flew here, Eric. It was great to have you on. I appreciate you taking the time. Like you said, we'll have to come on 6 months again and see how these things are developing further. But thank you so much for coming on the show, for talking us through both how the team is using it, as well as how you kind of look at it from a product standpoint. Yeah, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, rest of your week, and hopefully stay in touch.
Yeah, it was a thrill. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. You too.